I remember the day the lawyer called. It was raining, not the kind that pours, but the kind that lingers, as if the sky can't quite bring itself to cry. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee, the newspaper spread before me, pretending to read the classifieds, even though I already had everything I needed. Or at least I thought I did. When he said the words, "The will's been executed," my hand went cold around the mug. It wasn't that I didn't know my husband had secrets. I just didn't know how deep they ran. We'd been married for 37 years. He was a quiet man, the kind that fixed things with his hands, but broke things with his silence. People used to call us steady, good folk, the couple that made it. If only they'd seen what the kitchen looked like when no one was around, the empty chair, the untold words sitting between us like dust on the windowsill. He died last winter. Heart attack, they said. Quick, almost merciful. But I'd be lying if I didn't feel relief. Not from his death, but from the exhaustion of trying to be enough for a man who was never really there. When the lawyer read the will, I sat in that small office with my daughter Ruth beside me. The ticking of the wall clock was louder than his voice. Every word felt like a slow unraveling of a life I thought I'd lived. To my wife, Margaret, I leave the family home and its contents. I exhaled, a small sigh of gratitude, but it was short-lived. On the condition that she vacates the property within 60 days. All remaining assets, including savings, vehicles, and business shares, are to be transferred to Miss Evelyn Hart. I didn't know the name, but Ruth did. Her eyes widened, and her hand trembled on mine. "Mom, that's his—" She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. The world around me blurred. The rain outside turned into a faint drumming, like 1,000 whispers against the glass. The lawyer cleared his throat, said something about appeal rights, valid signatures, final wishes. I just nodded. That night, I sat on our porch with the will in my lap, reading it over and over. His handwriting, the small scrawl on the witness page, looked like a stranger's. I traced it with my finger, wondering how a man who shared my bed for half a lifetime could leave me like a shadow in his final act. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found out the truth too late? The next morning, I drove to the address I found in his old ledger, the one labeled E. Hart. A small house at the edge of town, white porch swing, yellow shutters. There was a woman outside watering her roses, younger than me, pretty, but tired. She looked up, startled, then almost relieved. She said, "Margaret?" She softly, as if she'd been expecting me. I didn't speak. I just watched the water dribble from her hose, pooling at her feet. She set it down, hands trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered. And in that moment, the world went still. No wind, no sound, just two women standing in the wreckage of one man's choices. That night, I didn't cry. I made tea, sat by the window, and stared at the sky. You'd think betrayal would sound like thunder, but it doesn't. It sounds like silence, like the hum of the refrigerator when the house is asleep.
If you're still listening, tell me, what would you have done? Would you have yelled or just gone quiet like I did? Because I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I just folded the will, placed it back in its envelope, and put it in the drawer next to his old pocket watch. And as the clock ticked softly through the night, I whispered to myself, he built a life with lies, but I'll build peace with truth. I'll tell you what happened next.
The days after the will felt strange, like living inside someone else's house. Every room looked familiar, yet foreign. The bed was made, the dishes washed, the air thick with his cologne that refused to fade. Even the clock on the mantel seemed louder, as if it too knew the time was running out. I kept thinking 60 days was just a number, but every tick reminded me it was a countdown to something I hadn't chosen, exile from my own life. I didn't tell anyone at first. Small towns are like echo chambers. One whisper, and everyone's life becomes a topic for coffee shop gossip. So I smiled in the grocery store, nodded at the church ladies, and said I was doing fine. But when I went home, I would open drawers, touch his shirts, and try to remember if there was ever a version of him that truly loved me. He'd left the house to me, but not for me. It was a technical mercy, wrapped in humiliation. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to pretend you were okay just to stop people from asking? One afternoon, Ruth came by with a folder full of bank papers. She's always been the practical one, sharp, protective. "Mom, this isn't right," she said, spreading out the documents on the table. "You can contest this. We can fight it." But I just shook my head. "I don't want to fight ghosts, sweetheart." She didn't understand. Maybe no one could. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the meaning, the quiet cruelty of knowing he'd chosen someone else to inherit the story we built together. A few days later, I found an envelope in the back of his dresser. It was yellowed, sealed, and had my name written on it. Margaret. The handwriting was his, but shaky, almost apologetic. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a letter, a receipt, for a piece of land outside town, signed by both him and Evelyn Hart. The date? 7 years before he died.
7 years. 7 years of Sunday dinners, anniversaries, and holiday photographs, all taken while he was building another life, 1 acre at a time. I drove back to Evelyn's house that evening. She opened the door before I could even knock. She must have seen my car pull up. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying for years, but never quite stopped. She led me inside, a small, tidy living room with framed photos of a man and a little boy. My breath caught. "Is that?" She nodded, eyes lowering. "His name's Daniel," she said quietly. "He's 10. I had to sit down. My knees wouldn't hold. All the air seemed to leave the room. He had a son. My husband had a son. I didn't scream. I didn't even weep. I just stared at the photo. The boy's smile, the way his eyes crinkled, the same way his used to when he'd tell a joke that only he thought was funny. It felt like staring at the truth, alive and innocent. Evelyn whispered, "He wanted to tell you, but he was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked. "That you'd hate him." I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't hate him. I pitied him for living 2 half lives instead of 1 whole one. if you're still here, tell me, have you ever discovered something that changed the way you remembered everything before it? When I drove home, the sun was setting over the fields, that soft golden light that makes even broken things look beautiful. I rolled down the window, and for the first time in months, I let the wind hit my face. It felt cleansing. That night, I went through the house room by room and began to pack. Not out of defeat, but choice. Each drawer I emptied, each picture frame I wrapped, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. By the time the moon rose high, the house no longer felt like his. It felt like a memory I could finally leave behind. And as I sat on the porch steps, surrounded by boxes and the soft chorus of crickets, I whispered to the night, "He took everything, but not my peace."
The morning I left the house, the sky was pale blue, that soft kind that makes you believe the world still has gentleness left in it. I loaded the last box into Ruth's car, took one last look at the front porch, and ran my hand along the railing her father built decades ago. The wood had aged, but it was still strong. That's what I wanted to be. Aged, but strong. I didn't cry. I just whispered a quiet goodbye to the house that had held my laughter, my grief, and my silence for nearly 4 decades. Sometimes letting go isn't a single act. It's 1,000 small ones. Ruth wanted me to move in with her, but I couldn't. I needed distance, not from her, but from everything that had defined me. So I rented a small cottage by the lake, a place where mornings were wrapped in mist and evenings ended with the sound of water touching the shore. The first night there, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. No echoes of footsteps. No weight of someone else's expectations. Just me and my thoughts. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to rebuild your peace from scratch? Weeks passed. I started volunteering at the town library. It felt good to be around stories that weren't my own, to shelve other people's words and escape mine for a while. People would nod, smile, and ask how I was settling in. I'd smile back and say, "I'm learning to like the quiet." And I was. But quiet has a way of revealing what we try to bury. One afternoon, as I was sorting through donation boxes, I found a small notebook wedged between 2 old novels. In the inside cover, there was a note in his handwriting. "For Margaret, because you always loved the endings." My breath caught. It was one of his old sketchbooks. Inside were drawings of furniture, tool diagrams, and then a small pencil sketch of a lake cottage, my cottage. I turned the page, and there, written faintly, was a date, 2 months before he died. It didn't make sense. The deed was in someone else's name. But he'd drawn this place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat under the dim lamp and stared at the sketch for hours. It felt like a message he hadn't managed to send. The next morning, I went to the county office to ask about the property's previous owner. The clerk, an older man with kind eyes, looked up from the records and said, "This cottage? It was bought back recently by someone named Evelyn Hart." I froze. "Evelyn." He continued, "She transferred it to your name 2 weeks ago, paid in full." I drove straight to her house. When she opened the door, she looked tired, softer somehow, lighter around the eyes. She said, "I didn't want to surprise you. He wanted you to have that cottage. He told me it was where you used to dream of retiring. I stood there in silence, unable to speak. I said, "He drew it." She nodded. "He did. He said he owed you peace, even if he couldn't give it while he was alive." There was no bitterness in her voice, just truth. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't my enemy. She was another woman who had loved a man who belonged to no one completely. If you're still listening, tell me, could you ever forgive someone who broke you if it meant freeing yourself? We sat together on her porch for a long time, saying nothing. Two women bound by one man's weakness, and yet somehow both stronger for surviving him. Before I left, she reached for my hand. "Margaret," she said softly, "I'm sorry." And I believed her. Not because her apology could undo what happened, but because forgiveness isn't about approval. It's about release. That evening, as I drove back to the lake, the world seemed quieter, clearer. The reflection of the sunset on the water looked almost like gold, fragile but radiant. And I realized that maybe peace isn't found in answers. Maybe it's found in finally stopping the questions. The summer came slowly that year. The kind of summer where the days stretched long and forgiving, and the nights hummed with crickets and the soft whisper of wind over the lake. I found a rhythm again. Not the one I used to know, filled with chores and expectations and someone else's moods, but a quieter, humbler rhythm. Tea in the morning, walks along the water, letters I wrote but never sent. People in town eventually stopped asking about the will. That's how small towns are. They talk until something newer comes along and silence replaces curiosity. But sometimes, when I'd be paying for groceries or walking past the hardware store, someone would give me that look, half pity, half wonder, as if they still couldn't believe I stayed calm through it all. And I suppose that's what peace looks like to people who's never had to rebuild it. One evening, I was sitting on the porch when Ruth came by with Daniel. Yes, that Daniel. Evelyn had asked if he could meet me. He was shy, polite, and too young to understand the storm he'd been born into. He brought me a jar of honey from their hives and said, "Mom says you helped make this place possible." I smiled. Then I guess we're both living proof that something good can grow from something broken. He grinned, that same crooked grin his father had, and for a brief moment, I saw the man I once loved, the one before the lies, before the silence. And for the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It simply existed. Softly, if you're still here, tell me, have you ever looked at the past and realized it no longer had power over you? After they left, I sat watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the lake. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for someone to see me, to choose me, to stay. And it hit me. I'd finally been chosen by life itself, by the quiet that stayed when everything else left. There's a kind of holiness in solitude. You stop needing closure from others because you begin to understand the only apology that matters is the one you give yourself for waiting too long to be free. A few weeks later, I planted a small rose bush near the porch, white roses, his favorite. And every morning when I water them, I whisper, "You're forgiven." Not because he deserved it, but because I do. Forgiveness isn't a gift to the person who broke you. It's a way of untangling your heart from theirs, of reclaiming your own name. Now, when people ask me how I'm doing, I just smile and say, I live by the lake. The rest is peace. So if you're listening right now, if someone's betrayal still keeps you awake at night, remember this: you don't have to make them pay. You just have to stop letting them rent space in your soul. Because when you finally choose silence over bitterness, you don't lose the fight, you end it. Because here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. Subscribe, stay with us, and help the silence end one true story at a time.